to ask a question to the audience. How many people here in this room are professional in the mobility business, whatever? Okay, so not that much, so that's why, I'm somehow aware of that, so that's why I would like to talk about mobility, of course, as a specific business, more than a metaphor. Because we experience, we work in mobility field for about 10 years now, and we learn a lot of interesting things. And we think that, compared to other domains we also work in, that mobility is an extraordinary example, metaphor of challenges that service designers are facing today. For example, you will find this kind of issues. Mobility, by definition, is a very complex governance, and also is a heavy industrial model. And let's just think, for example, talking about rolling stocks. For example, a train or an underground train will supposed to last for about 30 years or something. And in the same time lapse, you will have about six different generations of Volkswagen Golf. So let's try that. So of course, it's a domain where you also everybody experiencing reduction of public funding, and that's very, very interesting to us as a user experience and service designer, the challenges that the new technologies are bringing in this domain. Starting with online trip planning, smart ticketing, real-time information, geolock, and so on. So that's the way I would like to invite you to understand what I will present today. Not just focus in such specific way on the example I will give, but just mind that it's a very good example to think what service design challenges are today. And as a metaphor of the world of today, maybe we can ask this question. Is mobility a metaphor, a dream gone wrong? What I want to say with that, personally, I'm impressed by the fact that the work where we're living in today is the result of a long-lasting creation, a long-lasting design process somehow. And we are living in the real experience of what some people dreamed of 100 years ago or even more. For example, look at this picture. You may say that I love very much this picture because actually you see that as the very first at the glance. Okay, this is another development program in China. Today. At the same time, you notice that the photo is like kind of vintage, and there's kind of and in fact, it is the maquette of the project designed by the Corbusier in 1922. So, see, what we are experiencing now in some part of the world, and is actually the idea that was thought 100 years ago. And then, maybe someone of you knows the Jetsons. It's interesting because there is some extraordinary sitcom. It's a long story, and I invite you to review on YouTube some of them. It's quite interesting, and what is interesting that this image is incredible, long-lasting in our experience, and everyone can ask, is our present world shaped by the Jetson choices about mobility? What if George Jetson took a flying bus or motorway instead of flying car? Unfortunately, he didn't. And that's what the world we have today. So, individual cars, and as you know, with just one guy in it, and they run just a few kilometers for a very short time in their day life, whatever. All the things that everybody knows about. With congestion, impressive congestion, pollution, whatever. And another consequence of this model is the spread of the urban space. This again is the fault of George Jetson somehow. Also Corbusier somehow, point of view. But okay, this is what we're dealing now with, talking about mobility. People living far and far away from their workplace, and they are obliged to spend a lot of hours in public transportation and in congestion and now we are in the world of crisis. For example, typically today, that was something that George Jetson never thought at, at a given moment. What if the fuel is in a regular basis up to €2 liter? And that's the result, of course, there's congestion everywhere. Mobility world today is the experience of congestion, everybody. This is, for example, Santiago, this is Paris, maybe your experience with RER train. So, once we talk about the Corbusier and George Jetson, is any vision out there? Maybe some of you will remember this is a campaign IKEA launched in France a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, and it was they created a lot of buzz about the fact, okay, wow, wonderful, IKEA is launching a new car. What is the car made by IKEA? It was interesting. And then there was a lot of attention paid to that. And, of course, the IKEA car is not a car. The idea was to launch the website of car sharing. Again, given the current situation about fuel costs and congestion, etc., IKEA starting to experience a decrease of the people going to their facilities. So they try some solution. For example, say, okay, let's see if people can gather, they can share their car to go to IKEA store. And that was an interesting idea, and of course, and again, what is interesting here that is completely consistent with the promise of IKEA. Car sharing is something you do by yourself. You make a choice, you build your own experience or sharing and so on. So, by the way, it was a good communication concept. So clearly something is happening there. The information I've found very few about the real use of the service provided by IKEA are not very, very good. There's not that much people using it. But, by the way, car sharing today is a reality. In France, there's up to 1 million members on the leading website, covoiturage.fr. So that means something. Of course, it's ridiculous if you compare with the huge numbers of people moving around with private cars, but it's something. And also something is happening, people decide to share their own car. So something is making kind of a new opening, but of course it's not enough. Maybe there's a long-lasting path, and as of today, still public transport seems to be the most efficient alternative in the near future. That's interesting also to notice that, by the way, that's actually effective because in a very large urban area like Ile-de-France, which is a region where Paris is at heart, about 42% of people use public transport on work trips, so it's a huge number of people using public transports. So let's focus. What did we discover looking at public transport? As a design agency, we have worked, as I said, for 10 years, more than 10 years, on several and dozens of projects on the different transportation networks, as RTP, as Lyon TCL network, and other cities in France, and also for transportation authorities like the regional authority, transportation authority of France, or CITRAL, who is the public transportation authority for the Grand Lyon region. So we had a lot of experience, and we saw with in a very, let's say, detailed way, a lot of networks. And what we experienced when you interview people, why they still hesitate to use public transportation. There's still, of course, I know that is a kind of exaggeration, but there's still a problem about image public transportation has. For example, when you own your own car, it's a status symbol, and your last generation smartphone is a must-have. It's something that makes sense to you. Of course, metro ticket is not that sexy, And again, talking about storytelling, about how I can tell my experience to my friends or to my community, and the car, we know all the imagine, people experience, may experience, the fastness, freedom, or whatever. And again, the phone is a function, social function, important function. Again, public transportation may be perceived like very forward kind of things. And again, you understand the game, again, in usability, talking about the real interfaces, what they actually provide, talking about function, and what they provide, talking about experience. There's still a very, very large difference. And again, also in sharing, and you can invite your friends in the car, and you can talk real time with your friends by the means of social networks on the smartphone. Again, very often experience of the other people, others in the public transport, sometimes is not very good. How can we change that? How in years of experience and project we tried and we experienced solution and models and methods to make things move on. One interesting thing is what is related to the governance issue. As I said, governance is something very complex in public transport, and I think everywhere in the world, in France maybe in a particular way, because of the very complex administrative structure. It is very important to understand who does what, who is responsible for what, and how this model is evolving, is moving. And it's interesting because it's moving actually very fast. Then service design can provide modelization used to share visions. And we know that there is a very important leverage to people understand what we're talking about in the project and why we have to do something and which is the direction and which kind of decision we have to take. And what we call user experience master plan, which is a global tool which includes other tools you all here know, like service blueprint and so on, The idea is to draft a global mapping of all the experience of the user on the real world and the digital world and at home, on the network, on the vehicle, and so on. And of course, that means, of course, to promote, to make some change happens in organizations. And the very first is how can we, as service designers, help organization to put user experience at the heart of their vision and their service design. Second, to change organizational things is not easy, as we know, but actually it is important. And of course, because that asks for new skills and that sometimes may create some conflict with the existing situations. So, some of you were at the conference, the Service Design Conference, the first we had in Paris, so I already showed some of the slides, so I apologize for this twice, but I think it's interesting to share that with you, the idea to say, okay, how can you, at a given moment, try to represent what is a stakeholder play, and to try to modelize how can you move and how actually does move. You see, for example, is a vision question about the mobility stakeholders play in France in the post-war years, where government, the state, was at the very heart of everything. You know, the state owned all the transport operators, owned most of the companies, manufacturers, and so on. So, of course, users were part of the game, but like, you know, very, let's say, not as a priority. Then something happened. You know, at the end of the last century, very important regulation changes and political changes with new layers of responsibility. You know, on one hand, on the top, the European Commission took an important role in governance about this kind of public services, and on the other level, local authorities took responsibility also on that. So that was sometimes somehow a problem, but on the other hand, the advantage is that some decisions were taken at the local level more and more with a closer relationship with the local users, which became to be seen like voters, you know, which is an important part of the game, of course, and something happened at that moment. And now, what we're experiencing is, for example, especially with the impact of the new technologies and social networks and so on, the role of users is growing up. You know, you also know how many value can bring in the system by crowdsourcing information, for example, by the users. And by the way, the users which also change lifestyles, and they move around for several different reasons, not just the typical homework, you know, trip, but for any kind of reasons. Another interesting point is to start also to see all these mobility issues in a largest vision of what is happening, what will happen in the urban area, what is called smart cities. That means that all these different activities and services will be more and more connected, and in order to have a better value, to bring better value to the user, and reduce costs, and better security and control, and so on. This is an interesting situation, because that creates another level of experience and a new capability to share data, for example. And given that, the operators are faced with new challenges. Typically, in the past, they were responsible to bring people, to run people from home to work, and from a station, a point in the network, to another point in the network. And more recently, operators started to take into account the door-to-door experience. So, just to give your address to another address. And moreover, we expect now from public transport operator to provide us high-quality information services, personalized, geolocalized, real-time information, and we expect that they talk to us as individuals. So that brings also new responsibilities and new skills and new capability to provide. So everybody agrees now that in public transport and mobility in general, information is a key. So let's look at information as a service. It's a service. Everybody agrees on that. Okay, that's right. Then, okay, how do we design a service? You know, actually, it was very funny when we talked with some organization, public transport. In their culture, in their jargon, service design is to plan the bus lines. You know, this is what they call service design in some organization. So we have to also to cope with this kind of confusion. See, we're talking about something else, talking about user experience and how to design user experience. They didn't know that, you know. So a tool is to answer this question. It was, as I mentioned before, what we call user experience master plan. Because when you go, we visit, of course, because I'm not talking about RTP, who is a very design-savvy company and which has very strong guidelines and who works perfectly well. But if you go everywhere, in France, it don't matter. I don't want to, criticize any specific network or whatever. But the reality is that, everything, in France there's a very funny way of speaking, à boire et à manger. I don't know. I can translate that in English. I think that means something like, there's everything mixed up, and you don't know what you have to choose, and everybody is confused and so on. That's it. That's a lot of different ways to show the same things. There's a symbol, of course, it's a metaphor, but everything is made in the same way. Layers of actions, of designs, or whatever, and with never a clear focus on the user needs. Okay. So again, we also visit things, we observe people, we do shadowing interviews, and we try to understand how the people actually use the network and how they actually move around. This is again Paris, and of course, fortunately, I discovered that as a speaker I cannot run for the RTP contest. Too bad.
Yeah, you can.
I can?
Yeah, sure.
So. But anyway, this is typically what we do when you try to document a journey. And then we try to start planning to represent scenarios, and everybody here knows very well, and to modelize what we call user journey versus service touchpoints mapping. In which moment of the user journey we need this kind of information, and we expect to meet a specific touchpoint and a specific content. And that brings us on this kind of model, which say, okay, the user is at the center of the problem, and is, you can say, surrendered, immersed in a very rich information universe, able to give him always again and again the choice to do the best choice for his mobility needs. Okay, so this is something we do currently, and what is interesting now, talking about change, is what is the future of public transport? Maybe one way is to start to think that private transport and cars are not enemies, are part of the same game and the same landscape of the same ecosystem, and you can link them by information infrastructure. So this is something starting to happen in different parts of the world, for example in the Netherlands, and more recently we are finishing right now a project for the Grand Lyon, the project called Only Move. So the Grand Lyon is a large Lyon urban area in the center of France. It's an area with 2.2 million inhabitants. And it's a very interesting place, it's a very complex, it's a very rich urban area with a lot of activities, and it's central in Europe. And it's interesting here, as you see the transport modes mix. Lyon is one of the cities where we start to see cars decrease below 50%. Of course, you can expect that normally in very large cities like Paris or Berlin or Manhattan, but it's interesting to see that also in smaller cities is something starting to happen. And when you have this going down to 50%, you can start to think differently. You can start to go further, to think you can go further, and to invite people to use a large array of solutions the authorities provide them. So the Grand Lyon And it was interesting also is that the project was run by, not by the transport authority, but the unit that is responsible for the streets. So the idea was to re-evolve websites for typical websites of traffic information to a global system, a multimodal system, who allows you to compare and make choices between private car, public transport, bikes, and whatever. So typically we work with this kind of technique, methods, very well, so I will not spend a lot of time on it. It was a very interesting, we had the chance to work with a very interesting, very proactive team, the client. We end up with defining some scenarios of web service strategy, then to focus on one of them, and then to modelize with wireframes. And we also were engaged and responsible for the design for the branding and the design of the identity of the service. And then at the end we design the service. And typically, what's interesting here is to have a unique trip planner interface when you can ask for, compare all the modes you can access. So, this is an example. The real service will be launched, the full service will be launched in the end of 2013. And what do we experience also, to conclude in this 10 years of experience in domain, that we strongly call for a change in the organization and to integrate new skills, which will allow us also to, someone to speak with. Sometimes it's not so easy. So, new expertise for example, we ask for someone in charge of user customer experience to all the real life and digital, and able to manage internal and external vendors. Information design manager, because at the end of the day, the real matter that make people aware of what they can do with public transport and mobility in general is information. Of course, we also need trains and buses or whatever, but that's not important. Information is more important. Thank you. Community management is another important issue, and everybody now is talking about that with a very poor idea of what we can do with that, but sure, in the future, talking again about crowdsourcing and the value of the user in the game, sure, public transport operator will need to manage that in a very serious and structured way. So, to conclude, at the end of the presentation, what is the answer to that? Maybe, okay, let's be optimistic. And we can see mobility as an opportunity to experience cultural change in designing fundamental services, hoping that we can learn takeaways to be used in other domains. Thank you.